welcome everybody. My name is Alex Clark and I am delighted to invite you and welcome you to this wonderful evening of writers sharing their work. It is, of course, a celebration of the wonderful Rathbones Folio Prize 2023 shortlists, hosted by 5 by 15. And we are delighted to be speaking to 5 of the best writers in the world working today. I have with me this evening Margot Jefferson, Amy Bloom, Sheila Heti, NoViolet Bulawayo, and Elizabeth Strout. And each of them will be joining me in turn to introduce their work. We'll then all join together to have a conversation, and we would absolutely love you to join in at any point by posting a question to the Q&A. As many of you will know, the Rathbones Folio Prize has been in operation. This is its 9th year, but this is its first year in a new and expanded format. This year we have separate categories for fiction, non-fiction and poetry. And we have writers joining us this evening from the fiction and non-fiction categories. You'll be able to see more of them if you'd like to by going along to the British Library on Sunday evening, and then on Monday evening, the category winners and the overall winner of the Folio Book of the Year will be awarded. But I'm going to start by welcoming our first writer of the evening. It is Margot Jefferson. Welcome, Margot. May I ask you to unveil yourself? Hello, it's lovely to see you. I don't feel so alone now on the screen. I have someone with me.
You have company, and you will have more.
I will have more as we go along through the evening. I have to say, my first thought is, look at your room behind you with books and manuscripts piled up. It's a writer's room.
It's a writer's chaos, semi-chaos. Yeah.
Well, it doesn't look very chaotic to me. Your book, Constructing a Nervous System, your second memoir, really, after Negroland. You've also written the work on Michael Jackson and so many essays and pieces of criticism. But I have to say, Constructing a Nervous System absolutely astounded me. It kind of stupefied me with the range of reference and the connections between the subjects and the people that you were talking about, and the feeling that you introduced in all those interstices. It's not a very good thing for an interviewer to be sort of struck dumb with wonder at a book, but I found it amazing. I am going to leave you now to introduce it to our audience, and then I will have found my tongue by the time I come back. Thank you so much, Margot.
Thank you. I am nominated for Constructing a Nervous System in the nonfiction category. I am, as Alex said, a critic and memoirist. For this book, I chose to think of a nervous system, or to pick the idea of a nervous system. For me, it was an assemblage of ideas, memories, sensations, feelings, other people's words, not just my own, that in my mind, I could combine, dissolve, disassemble, and recombine. Recreating this, yet another nervous system. My aim, I wanted criticism to have the intensities and the intimacies that we readers look for in memoir. And I wanted memoir to have the range, intellectual, interpretive, contextual, that we want from criticism. So my aim was to join them, to juxtapose them, to draw on all kinds of tones, voices, genres, and to make my persona, as I encountered my subjects and objects, as varied as they were. They include Bud Powell, Bing Crosby, Willa Cather, Josephine Baker, a verbal mashup of Sylvia Plath and Gertrude Ma Rainey, The Liar, and I Am a Fugitive from a Chain Gang. So I'm going to read 2 short passages, one, the opening, and then one from further along. I stood in a bright, harsh light. The stage was bare. I extended my arm, flung, hurled it out, pointed an accusatory finger, then turned to an unseen audience and declared, This is the woman with only one childhood. It was part of the dream work, the night's dream work. And I was rattled when I woke up, for I had been addressing myself. I understood what I had to do. At the end of his stage show, Bill Bojangles Robinson would look up at the lighting booth and shout, "Give me a light, my color." Pause, then blackout. When the light returned, I knew it was time to construct another nervous system. Women's anger needs to be honored, celebrated, and protected the way virginity used to be. Female anger is a discipline, a repertory of styles. Each requires vocal, gestural, emotional skills, a clear sense of what the situation offers and how the story unfolds. Growing girls need anger models, muses, coaches, and exemplars. What works best? Tempestuous fury? Amused disdain? Quiet but not temperate resistance? The child is not mother to the woman, as in Wordsworth's stately formation. She's a disruptive part who gets quashed, reduced to a heap of remnants. Remnant, noun, chips, cuttings, fragments, or other small pieces of raw material removed, cut away, flaked off, etc., in the process of making or manufacturing an item. Thank you.
Margot, thank you so much. I love the juxtapositions in the book, and I think perhaps the one that I thought, wow, was when you juxtaposed George Eliot and W.E. Du Bois, W.E.V. Du Bois, and I just thought this is and put almost as if they were having a conversation. It was extraordinary. But as becomes apparent, you were creating a memoir. It is in part a memoir. And at the beginning of the book, you speak of the need to dismantle yourself. I think you said this edifice was too fixed. I wanted it to become an apparatus of mobile parts. And I thought that spoke so much to the kind of anxiety we have when trying to describe ourselves and our lives. Tell me what it meant for you and what you wanted to do.
What I wanted was to find ways, technical, i.e. writerly, emotional, musical, to create a kind of repertory company of myself as I encounter all of the materials of my life, the factual, historical, as well as imaginative life, but also of works of art, of entertainment that we live through and with actually as acutely as we do those lives with our parents, our schoolmates. All of the subjects we tend to think of in a more realistic way when in conversation: aesthetics, race and ethnicity, gender, sexuality, all of those, depending on what parts of your temperament wig onto them, including things that you're embarrassed by or ashamed of. That was crucial. All of those things make a repertory of self possible, rather than a fixed creature who is stepping step by step, logging her way through, the chronology, emotional as well as literal, of a life.
Well, this is just such a fantastically embodied book, apart from being this great sort of intellectual inquiry and emotional inquiry. Yeah. But I think the moment when you wrote really so acutely and movingly, really, about something Ella Fitzgerald, and then the issue of her sweat, the issue of her sweating and her figure and her corporeality. Corporeality
and
as important.
The shame about it, the pride in her artistry, all so much a part of the gender and racial and young girl hitting adolescence of the time. And I wanted to get it all. It actually had started with looking at a photograph on an album cover of the great pianist Bud Powell sweating. and remembering looking at Ella Fitzgerald records or watching her on TV at the same time and being ashamed as opposed to enraptured. So it would be moments like that that would start off a chain of thought and an intense engagement with a kind of psychological and musical rendering and reading of a tisket, a tasket.
Yes. Margot, thank you so much. We will come back to you in a short while.
Happy to listen from now.
And thank you very much. Thank you to Margot Jefferson. As I think I've intimated, Constructing a Nervous System is a wonderful, wonderful book. And here is another one. I'm going to ask Margot to briefly disappear, and I'm going to welcome to our virtual stage Amy Bloom, who is going to talk about her memoir, In Love, a memoir of love and loss. Amy, so well known to so many readers for such a long time as a brilliant short story writer and novelist. You also work in film and TV. This is a memoir. Tell us a little bit about what it is.
It's this book, In Love, is my one and only memoir. I don't feel like I have much expertise in writing memoirs. I never planned to write a memoir, but this is the book that my late husband asked me to write. It is about his diagnosis of early onset Alzheimer's. He was in his early 60s, working very successfully as an architect when the symptoms began. And when he finally got his diagnosis of Alzheimer's, he immediately made his decision that, having seen Alzheimer's close up in his own extended family, he was not going to be there, as he said, for the long goodbye. And I told him I could take care of him. He could stay at home. It would be all right. And he said, "You're not hearing me. I am going to die on my feet. I am not going to live on my knees." And that began our search for a peaceful, painless death for him, which led us to Dignitas in Zurich. And this is really the book of all those things. And the book really began as the kind of notes that you take as a caregiver, get cereal, get to the doctor's appointment, and so on. And then, as Brian very strongly expressed his wish that I should write about this, because he felt that people didn't know enough about end-of-life choices, and choice was a big subject for him. The notes became the pages, and the pages became the book about our life together and his illness and his decisions and his death and our journey towards that.
It is incredibly, incredibly moving, but also I found it just immensely informative on the question of the right to die and on the question of what happens to somebody who wants to take charge of their own life. I will leave you now to speak a little bit more about it and then give us a reading. Thank you very much, Amy.
Okay. The heart of this book, really very much following what Margot had to say, as I am always happy to do, it is all about subjects and objects. It is about illness and what that means and how we interpret that, and the end of life and making decisions. It is certainly about parents and children and family, all of whom were very much involved in our story. And I think for me, when I looked back at it, it's a little hard to know what you're writing when you're writing. It was really about this journey through our relationship, from its slightly scandalous beginnings to the very end, and always just questions of sort of what it is to be a person, and how do we make decisions, and how do you make decisions based on your feelings, which are quite different than our thoughts, and also how you change, I think, in a marriage and in a relationship. And those are some of the subjects and some of the objects. And this little section I'm going to read is called Messages Not Received. By late 2016, I knew something was wrong. I had been reading the Alzheimer's information and research websites, and then I stopped reading them because I could not bear to know what it was that was wrong. Every page emphasizes what had to be done to deal with the loss of cognitive function, the appointments, the cell phone, the driving, and later the names, the hygiene, the missing chunks of personal history, plus a highlights reel of the very distant past. But a lot of the websites focused on the way in which the person was still there despite the losses, not all doom and gloom, as one website said. And some of the sites tell me how it is when the person begins to fade away as the neurons stop functioning, lose connections with other neurons, and die. That's what they do. Neurons connect, communicate, and repair. And that's what Alzheimer's destroys: connection within and without. First in the entorhinal cortex and the hippocampus, and then in the cerebral cortex, language processing and social behavior. And that is what I was seeing in Brian. Those neurons, the brain soldiers, march for years from the time we're born through the byways of the brain, setting actions into motion, rolling away boulders of all kinds. And then with Alzheimer's, they're blocked by trees down at one end of the road or dangling wires at another. And over the years, the brain soldiers, these well-trained and reliable army, has done so much on so many different terrains, gone high and low, swum, climbed, strolled, and marched to all the different destinations of the mind, begin to falter long before outsiders can see the troubles. The obstacles cannot be overcome. Messages cannot be received. The soldiers cannot break through to new ground, and retreat is the only possible path. And you'd be a fool to try to lure someone out amid the heavy artillery. Alzheimer's all the time is, for me, 1914. And a good day with Brian now is that famous Christmas truce, which was quite short and quite beautiful. The German boys caroling to the English, calling out, "Merry Christmas, Englishmen," as they climbed out of the trenches, tobacco shared, souvenirs exchanged, rations shared, and prisoners swapped, and then never repeated. Retreat makes sense, and it is agony for me, and I think not much of anything now for Brian. That steady loss, that steady unraveling is sometimes paused, but never stopped. The shape of the self is held together as well as can be with the use of alternative pathways in the brain. Brian began addressing each of the granddaughters as darling or little girl, and he referred to his book club only as those guys at that thing. He got back up from me, and then none of it was enough. And the vessel of his self and his mind, some beautiful Egyptian jug of Nile clay and jute, began to soften and drop its walls, but not sharply, only as if the straw was being pulled out stalk by stalk, and then it was not the jug it was, and it couldn't hold a thing. It's just a pile of clay and straw in the palm of your own hand. Thank you.
Amy, thank you so much. I mean, it would be no surprise to anybody to hear that this is, of course, a very moving book. It's also often a very funny book. You talk about, your own losses of temper or insight, the flashes of humor that you both have. I particularly liked it when you introduced us to a doctor who couldn't bear to give anyone good news, who you nicknamed Good Time Charlie.
Yeah.
So, you've got to, in the round, present the whole of an experience, haven't you? And yet you did this you began on this very shortly after your husband's death. I wonder what that felt like to you, grappling with all these different emotions.
Well, part of it, I think, was I'm a writer, so this is something I know how to do. As Brian himself said, if we had a leaky faucet, we'd call a plumber. We need a book. And there I was. He also had a very good sense of humor. In fact, at one point when he was sort of talking about ways in which he might end his life after the diagnosis, he said, well, maybe you can decide and you can do something. You can end my life. That's what you can do. And I said, honey, I don't think I can do that. I certainly can't do that in America. There are laws against it, and I might go to jail. And he said, oh. And then he came back into the kitchen. He said, you'd be great in jail. You're so resourceful. So I think, the book for me was an effort to be the writer he wanted me to be. And also, anyone who's ever been a caregiver, you have a little notebook. Go to the doctor, get the cereal, find the vitamins, do the appointment, make sure that there's overlapping care. And so I already had a lot of notes. And then after he passed, I thought, well, I should get back to work. I had sort of imagined for myself, I have to say, as one of my daughters said, a sort of gauzy Chekhovian extended mourning period. But it was also the beginning of COVID. And so that was not to be. And so my younger daughter, her wife, and their baby moved in about 3 weeks after Brian's death. And then there's a great image from Diane Ackerman from one of her essays on nature, in which she talks about the dead log in the forest and how nature just shoots up out of it. And that was very much how I felt. And it was how I felt even in writing the book, happily or unhappily. You don't have to wait around for grief. You don't have to sort it out first. It goes right with you.
Amy, thank you so much for telling us about In Love. You're going to go away now into the virtual rating room with Margot, but we will talk a lot. I've loved the way that there are connections between all these books, and I'm really interested to hear the connections you'll made, perhaps even with my next guest, Sheila Heti, whose book Pure Color, whose novel Pure Color, is very much about grieving, among many other things. So, Amy, we will see you in a short while, and welcome to Sheila. Sheila, Pure Color, as many critics have noted, feels as if it's quite different from some of your previous novels, like How Should a Person Be and Motherhood. I don't know if that's quite the case. What do you think?
I think it's different. It felt different to write it. The book came to me sort of in these discrete chunks that I kept thinking I was done. And then 6 months later, something else would come. And it felt like with the previous books, much more active on my part, a much more of a struggle and much more of an intellectual challenge. And this one felt like it was coming from some part of me that wasn't so it came from like a more intuitive place, let's say. So it does feel like a different kind of book to me.
Well, I'm going to disappear from the screen now, and I will leave you to explain to the readers what it's about, what its purview is, and read a little section from it, and then we will chat again. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, Pure Color is a book that takes place in what I call the first draft of existence, which is the world that we all inhabit together. And the book begins with God sort of looking at the world, stepping back from the world like a painter steps back from the canvas, and seeing what he's made and seeing the errors. And like an artist wants to make it better, and sort of births humans as his critics, as the art critics of his creation. I think part of the reason I want to write this book is being somebody who, I'm not exactly on social media myself, but I experience that world. I experience my lived world. And I was just thinking a lot about criticism and critique. And I wanted to make criticism like the most important activity for a human, not something that we have to get rid of, that depresses us, and that we, but something that could like remake the world potentially, a second draft, which none of us will ever see. So that's sort of the frame for the book. And then there's a character in it named Mira. Midway through the book, her father dies. And like Amy's book, it's about my own experience of grief. But sort of the beauty, the purity, the colorfulness, even the ecstasy in some way of being so close to such an essential thing in life as death. I'm going to read a little part from early in Mira's life. We sort of see her throughout her life. This is when she's young. And it's just one little passage that I'd like to read. She attends a school called the American Academy for American Critics. Mira would sit in the lamp store and gaze at one lamp in particular. It had green blobs and red blobs, little polished stones of colored glass that were held together by a network of iron. The shade was a half oval with a beautiful iron stand. It was the most wonderful thing Mira had ever seen. She would sit and wait for the day to turn dark when she could turn off every other lamp and stare at her favorite, with its translucent stones illuminated from within. She would spin this shade so gently, and its colored light would fall on the walls and her. Since the lamp she liked best was the least expensive one, it was possible that one day she might own it, if no one bought it first. Perhaps the fact that it was the least expensive one was the reason she had made it her favorite. There is no point in loving something that is not a bit within reach. It was the essential humility of the lamp that drew her to it. It had not been made by someone with any sort of insight into how a person might want to appear to others, or who believed that people acquired things to show them off to their friends. It had not been made by someone who imagined that an object fit into a greater system of values or could place its owner among others with similar taste. It had been made by a humble person who simply thought, "Now I will make my next lamp." Whenever Mira came in for her shift, the first thing she did was look to see if the lamp was still there. It always was. She guessed that her boss must know how much she liked it, although she never asked. Probably every employee had their favorite lamp.
Sheila, thank you so much. Just picking up on what you were saying early about the intuitive way of writing this. I think I read an interview in which you said you had started writing this book, a version of this book, and then your father died, and then it became intuitive. You felt very cut off from the rest of the world, and also what people's opinions of it might be, early readers and so forth. And I wondered what that actually meant into the intuitive way of writing. What did that mean for you in practice?
Well, I think it was sort of like that all along, even before my father passed away. I feel like I was writing it already for a year. And when he died, it did change the direction of the book, but it sort of made a lot of the things that I was writing about make more sense. There was, like Amy was saying, there was a period of time after he died that I was sort of taking notes and wanting to remember what the last weeks of his life were like and what the experience was of being with him. I hadn't thought that that was going to go into a book, but then after 6 months or 8 months, I looked at those notes that I had taken and I realized that they had everything to do with this book that I'd been writing about losing things, about moving through life and the way that the world looks becoming something different, about the idea of a first draft in life and a second draft. When somebody you're really close to dies, it almost feels like you're in a brand new life. So it almost feels to me like the whole book had been there at the start, but just different phases of life had to be undergone in order for them all to come together and be written about.
Well, I must say, when I read it, and my father had died a couple of years before, and I thought it was one of the most extraordinarily accurate depictions of grief that I had ever read in fiction.
Oh, thank you.
Because you felt like it got to the heart of that idea of wanting to collapse your identity into someone else's, of feeling that you wanted somehow to grasp something essential about the person that you had lost. And that in many ways makes it a sort of metaphysical novel, an almost theological novel. Would you describe it in that way, I wonder?
Yeah, I think so. I think it is all those things. I felt like at that time more in touch with words like soul and spirit than the actual physical world. And I think that happens to a lot of people when somebody you love dies. You sort of separate yourself from the world. You can't really engage with other people, or you have to, but you can't, and with everyday life, and you're in some other space. something else opens up to you, some other plane of existence, it feels like. And that's where the middle of the book takes place, in a realm sort of separated from that very tangible world that she had been in that I read about before.
Sheila, thank you so much for giving us a description and a real flavor of pure color. We will meet again very shortly. And now I'm going to speak to NoViolet Bulawayo, whose novel Glory is, well, fresh from many shortlistings, including a shortlisting for the Booker Prize. Hello, NoViolet. Welcome to you. We spoke when the book came out, I think, first, when I interviewed you then, and you were very interested in the idea that you were writing about a time in history, but you had to separate it from that. You had to make it almost fabular. You had to create this story that was told by animals, that bore a great deal of resemblance to Zimbabwe, but was not Zimbabwe. Tell me how that idea first came about. NoViolet, I'm just going to stop you briefly because we're not able to hear you for whatever reason. I am going to just briefly hide myself, and I'm going to ask our producers to see if they may be able to sort out what's going on with your sound, because we want to hear what you have to say.
Oh. Can you hear me now?
I can indeed.
Okay.
I can indeed. I wonder if I may ask you to say what you were saying in response to my question again. Apologies.
No, that's fine. So the choice came from me being on the ground in Zimbabwe and trying to follow and write about a story that was unfolding. I was too close to the narrative in ways that didn't give me the independence, the freedom that I'm kind of used to as a storyteller. I was also encouraged to actually think about the stories that I had not considered when I first embarked on the project. And these were the stories of ordinary Zimbabweans who were actually dealing with what it meant to live under an oppressive and violent regime. So turning to the animal kingdom allowed me to both give myself a distance and actually honor those the voices of ordinary Zimbabweans, and also sort of tap into the oral tradition that kind of powers the novel.
Violet, thank you. No, Violet, thank you. I'm just going to briefly disappear to let you take us to the kingdom of Jadada and just explain a little bit about the book and give us a reading from it. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. So Glory is a story of tyranny. It's a story of resistance and freedom that was very much inspired by the fall of Zimbabwe's Robert Mugabe back in 2017. Up until that point, he really had been the only president I'd ever known for close to 4 decades. The novel is also interested in the aftermath as well as the country's ongoing struggle for freedom, as well as similar stories and situations around the world, because tyranny is not unique to Zimbabwe. Unfortunately, it's a narrative that we're seeing very much of. Writing the book meant interrogating my place in the moment, asking myself, what can I do about the situation? What can I give? What can I contribute? And I was consistently drawn back to the great Toni Morrison, who said of writing around troubled moments, I'm going to read her quote. This is precisely the time when artists go to work. There is no time for despair, no place for self-pity, no need for silence, no room for fear. We speak, we write, we do language. That is how civilizations heal. So I guess the novel was my way of trying to heal us. And I'm going to read a short paragraph that speaks to how I imagined, what I imagined that healing could look like. It's called The Portrait of a Silence. It happens during a rally in which one of Glory's main characters has been shot by the defenders who are stand-ins for the police. Portrait of Silence. When those who were there told those who went there that destiny's wake was held in utmost silence, Toluti, what they meant was that destiny's wake was held in utmost silence, that no word was ever uttered for anything or any reason by anybody, that not even a prayer, not a funeral song was heard. There were no sad sighs, no sniffles. If tears were shed, they were silent tears. If things needed to be said, animals looked into each other's eyes without blinking until whatever needed to be communicated was expressed and understood beyond a shadow of a doubt. That even the breathing was done in silence, that bodies moved with the quiet of shadows, that even when Gloria and her young friends laced together their old tennis shoes and zipped them toward electric wires, they didn't utter a single word, and that the tennis shoes flew in silent silence and the wires caught them in silence also. That next door inside Eden, when the Duchess fell into a trance and Kunzemnyama arrived blinded by the reddest rage, his terrible fury was perfectly mute, and the drums that welcomed him were soundless drums, and that the flies too were silent, and the cockroaches were silent, and the mosquitoes were silent, and the mice were silent, and the birds were silent, and the cicadas were silent, and the crickets were silent, and everything was silent. It was just silent. Tollywood is silent, silent, silent.
No, Violet, thank you so much. I mean, we grasp some of the novel's epic sort of power there. It's such an absorbing narrative. I was thinking a little bit about the aftermath of publishing this book. And I remember when we spoke before, you were talking about the importance of telling stories when you are trying to represent a world and a society that the rest of the world somehow doesn't know what to do with. You described feeling a certain degree of optimism about especially the younger generations in Zimbabwe, but also that idea of trying to get a story out there so that people could engage with it beyond their normal parameters. Do you feel that has happened? The book has had an extraordinary response. Do you feel that has happened in any meaningful way?
Quite frankly, I think it's too early to tell. I definitely wrote the book with Zimbabwe in my heart. I don't think enough Zimbabweans have read the book to kind of give a response to it. But I'm encouraged by the feedback from those who have read. I think one thing that resonates is that people feel like they are seeing the story. You know, they are seeing their lives on the page. But of course, the question that I beg at the end of the novel is, what are we going to do about our predicament? I think I talked to you last time we spoke about the Zimbabwean woman I met in Botswana, which is our neighbor to the southwest. We were both shopping for groceries because it's cheaper for those who live near border towns. And she gave me what I took to be a challenge. She said something like, and I'm paraphrasing, she said, you should write about this moment. Maybe through your writing, something is going to click in our imaginations, and it's going to help us figure our way out of the situation. And for me to hear a reader have so much faith, believe in the possibilities and the power of literature was really, really humbling. I remember that I thought about her words for the most part while I wrote the book. And I am hoping we get to the point where not just her, but many readers read the text and come back, because it's a conversation. I'm interested in their part of the conversation.
NoViolet, thank you so much. We will come back to you when we all meet again together after our final guest for the evening, which is Elizabeth Strout. And just as Elizabeth comes onto the stage and joins us, make yourself visible, Elizabeth. I will just remind you, please, all to submit questions via the Q&A button to any of the authors about anything. They will, I am sure, answer any of your questions. But now I'm going to talk to Elizabeth about Lucy by the Sea. Well, we know the character. This is not Lucy's first rodeo. She has become an absolutely beloved character, but this time she is in isolation. This is a pandemic novel, isn't it?
Yes, it takes place during the pandemic, and yet I don't personally think of it as a pandemic novel, because I'm always interested in characters. That's what drives me forward as a writer. So I'm very interested in this just being about Lucy, and also her ex-husband William, that she's gone into isolation with, and what happens to them in the situation.
I'm going to now disappear and let you explain to everyone what happens when William decides that he must get Lucy out of New York City.
Right. Well, this book came to me. I had literally just finished Oh, William. And so Lucy and her ex-husband William were still very much in my head. And then all of a sudden the pandemic began. And I realized that that something terribly important was happening. And I actually thought briefly of making an epilogue to Oh, William, and having William take her off to a different part of Maine than they had been. And then I realized, no, I liked the way Oh, William ended. I didn't want to have the reader turn the page and find a different sort of scene. And so it's a good thing I didn't do that, because the pandemic went on. But it was very interesting to write it in, I've never written anything as much in real time. And what I was trying to capture was how do I make Lucy continue to grow while her life has apparently, time has imploded. So that was sort of what I was interested in trying to get at. I'm just going to read one page and from the middle of the book, and that will be that. That night I could not fall asleep, and my mind went to different places as it did on such nights, and I remembered this. Years ago in New York City, I had taught at a community college, and there was a man who taught there as well. He was much older than I was, and he retired soon after I got there. He was a nice man with thick eyebrows, and he was quiet, though he seemed to like me, and we would sometimes talk in the hallways. He told me that his wife had Alzheimer's, and that he could not remember the last words she had spoken to him, because she'd become gradually more and more silent, and then she remained silent. And this man, her husband, could never remember the last thing she had said. And thinking of this now made me think of something I had often thought before, that there had been a last time when they were little that I had picked up the girls. This had often broken my heart to realize that you never know the last time you pick up a child. Maybe you say, oh, honey, you're getting too big to be picked up, or something like that. But then you never pick them up again. And living with this pandemic was like that. You did not know. Thank you.
Elizabeth, thank you. Thank you so much. I mean, one of the things that struck me about Lucy and one of the ways that she grew was at the beginning of the novel, she's terribly resistant. There's obviously the practical issue. William knows more about what's coming because he's a scientist. She doesn't, and she's very disbelieving. This is not a particularly sort of uncommon reaction that we all had, couldn't really believe that this was happening. But then there they are in Maine, and she is now, with our hindsight, kind of bewilderingly cross about small things, about a quilt that she doesn't like, or the cold weather, or not having the right things to eat. You pictured her as a kind of pernickety person there in a way, didn't you?
Well, she was just being, you know, what I considered to be Lucy. I was just concentrating very hard on what Lucy was feeling throughout the whole existence.
And she's very, very extremely forthright about the degree to which William was really getting on her nerves.
Yeah,
in a way that I think we often felt before we realized, you know, we were lucky if we were with somebody, but, you know, people got on your nerves in close quarters.
Right. Yeah.
One thing I wanted to ask you, there is a moment in which she thinks to herself, I will never write another word again. Now, obviously, that hasn't happened for you, but was it a thought that you had, that things were of such moment, that the world was so altered?
No, I never had that thought. That's Lucy's thought. I was inside Lucy's head as I wrote that.
And you felt that you were always going to want to chronicle this experience.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not Lucy. She's somebody that I just...
No, exactly. It is, as you say, it's a novel about, you know, it's not a novel only about the pandemic. It takes place in the pandemic. It is also about the sort of waning of and waxing of closeness between these two people and their extended family, who they can't see.
By the end of the novel, all four of these characters have changed dramatically.
I don't suppose this is, well, you may know it, you may not want to share it, but is Lucy going to continue to be with us in fictional form? Are you going to continue to write about her?
I suspect that the first person narrations of Lucy are done.
Okay, thank you. I am going to welcome all the authors back to the virtual stage now. I'm going to remind you again to send us your questions. But as you can see, what an incredible panoply of talent we have here, and what interesting connections these books have between one another. I mean, sometimes they're sort of overt. You know, for example, Amy and Sheila, you know, grief is such a presence in both of your books. But I was also interested in how much you were all grappling with form. Thinking, Amy, first, you know, going into this, you said that it's your one bit of memoir. It's a you know, a very different kind of book than the book that you've written before. But did you feel that there is a kind of continuation from your works of fiction to the memoir that you wrote?
Well, I mean, there is a sort of underground connection. There's a sort of river connection, which is that they're all written by me, and they have some of my voice and some of my point of view and some of the things I like and I don't like. It's very funny when Margot was reading and she was talking about Ella Fitzgerald. It's one of my favorite sections of her work because I'm such an Ella Fitzgerald fan. And I listened to music all the time, but I was especially listening during a lot of Brian's illness, and, you know, watching his musical tastes change as he kind of kept referring back to the past. And so we had, you know, music I was listening to in my office and music he was listening to in the kitchen. And I think you know, the things that I write about are the things that are interesting to me. And I as a fiction writer, and I don't know that this would have been in some sense my choice, but it is also true that, as my children say, I only have a few subjects, which are, as they say, love, sex, family, death. There
That
you
covers-
I don't think I don't think I'm going to come up with a longer list in the next 10 years. And so that is all in the memoir, as it is always in my novels, because those are the things that I think about and feel about.
They are the big subjects. I mean,
Yeah.
you're not going to get many bigger subjects than that. Margot, I wanted to ask you about, you know, as we've noted, you write about all these figures from the culture, from Black culture, and not only Black culture connections, as I was mentioning, George Eliot and W.E. Du Bois there, the connections over time and culture and country. But you also write personally too, a great deal about your own development as a thinker and a writer and as a woman and as a Black woman, and also about your sister. And there is a degree of memoir and grief and commemoration of your sister in this novel, in this memoir, isn't there?
There is, and it's amazing what you can kind of forget. When Amy and Sheila were talking, I suddenly remembered, oh my God, very early in this book, I point out that I'm an orphan because my mother and sister are both dead. And, you know, all the bodies of the family are lying on the stage. And I'm the person, you know, who has to go out and speak new lines and enter a new play. That was useful for me in terms of form, meaning trying new things. But yeah, you need, whether it's the distance of form, which NoViolet's choice I find very interesting, whether it's the distance of form or simply of time. I couldn't have written with the combination of love and, you know, you were kind of a bully towards my older sister, without a certain amount of time and the formal knowledge that I could move. You know, it didn't just have to stay on her, but she was my muse in certain ways for this story of growing up as an upper middle class Black woman at a certain historical period, where you are over-determined racial in terms of race, gender, class, and also underdefined, underseen, underperceived. So, you know, she had such a strong personality that, you know, that tension of a psyche and a will going up against the expectations and the so-called, the brutalities and the civilities. She was very useful in that way for me.
I must ask you on that note, because just it speaks to exactly what you've just been saying. There is a wonderful part in the book where you recount her response to Martha Graham, and a sort of anecdote about her. I suppose in a sense, her sort of assumption of Martha Graham's form. I wonder if you'd tell it for our viewers.
We should go on. My sister, we all have our compensations, maybe in those parts of our social lives that can be invented. And my sister was very touchy, and it had to do with race and class, about being in any place with white salespeople whom she felt were not paying her sufficient attention or giving her enough. Like I said, she could be a bully even when she was being victimized. And she devised this response. If she felt she wasn't getting the attention, she would look at the saleswoman and say, "Do you know who I am? I'm Martha Graham." And you know, what would follow would be great puzzlement, but it got her attention. Then she switched to Diane Carroll, and she would simply go back and forth. Impersonation is critical in a world socially, politically, where your status is always shifting, and you are trying not to respond to it in only one way, like defensive hauteur or cravenness.
I thought it was a fantastically imaginative strategy for dealing with that exact same thing in a wonderful part of the book. NoViolet, I just wonder if I could ask you a question that's come in from one of our audience members, Sam, who says, did NoViolet write Glory with the idea of how it would sound if read aloud? As I listened to it and found so much power in the voices, the rhythms, the repetitions, the I can't breathe, I can't breathe, I can't breathe, says Sam. Was that something that you thought of? It does have an incantatory sort of power.
Absolutely. I think everything I write is written with the ear. And again, coming back to my orator influences and inspiration, I just don't imagine a reader who picks up a book and reads quietly. I imagine a performance. I imagine the book being read out loud. So the process of writing also means, stopping at every sentence, reading it out loud, thinking about how it sounds, and then moving on to the next. Yeah.
I wonder if any of the other writers here have the same feeling about that work. Elizabeth, do you read aloud when you're writing?
Well, I think that, the way the sentence falls on the ear of the reader is the most important thing in a certain kind of way, because that reader will be absorbing the sound. And when one has to be, I think that the writer has to be very conscious of the sound that is falling on the ear of the reader.
What kind of sound do you think you were hoping that as it were, sort of Lucy and William's voices, what they were doing in Maine, what kind of sound did you think that might make as it fell?
Well, because it's Lucy's voice that's telling the story, it's a particular kind of sound that comes from her voice. There's a little bit of an urgency, there's a little bit of a hesitancy, there's, she's got her own inimitable voice, I think, but it has to still, I have to be aware that that voice is going to fall on the reader's ear in a way that the reader can therefore incorporate and take in.
Sheila, what about you? Does the way something, the rhythm of something, because again, this is pure color, has a great sort of abstraction at certain moments, or it appears to, we're asked to imagine all sorts of impossible things. As it is read, how does that feel to you?
I think that's what all editing is. It's trying to get the sentence to have the right music. I don't read out loud, but I hear my sentences in my head. I feel kind of bewildered when people talk about writing with music on, because for me, that would be jarring or distracting from hearing the prose. I'm sure there's a way of doing it, but I never found out a way of doing it for myself. So yeah, I think every writer has a kind of music or rhythm that sounds right to them sentence by sentence, and that's what they're editing for, and that's what voice is, and that's who they are, is that rhythm in the sentence.
I wonder if I could ask you a little bit about this, slightly picking up on a question from the audience here, and for everybody, but I may start with you, because art criticism is very important to a certain strand of the novel, and as you've explained, to the way that you envisaged the novel, the importance of criticism. And someone asks, do any of the authors take inspiration from other creative forms, for example, visual art, for their writing? Did you literally think about art, or was it sort of the act of criticism that was the most important thing for you to address in this book?
I thought about painting. God's a painter in the book, and so pure color is like, if a painter paints with paints, God would paint with pure color. So painting was very important to me. I thought a lot about Manet, who's a painter that I love. And when I first started the book, I was thinking a lot about the critics of Manet. There's a book called Manet and His Critics that I really love, which was the reviews that were written about his paintings at the time of the Paris salons when he was first exhibiting them, and the anger that people had towards his paintings, and the revulsion, and just they looked so different when they first appeared in the world. And I'm so interested in that, how art can first seem so repellent, and then over time we can't even see what made people so upset with those paintings. And so I I'm very interested in how the reception of artwork has to do with how familiar we are with what it's doing. So yeah, I think I was thinking about art critics and painting and painters.
Would anybody else like to come in on that? Does it mean anything particular to anyone? Does visual art accompany or any other art form? I mean, Margot, a lot of your book is
Music
dancing and
music
singing and
dance probably
yeah.
are the most.
Yes. Amy.
Oh, for me, it's music. I mean, it's what I spend a lot of time listening to, not when I'm writing. I feel the same way. I feel like since you're sweating and fussing over the sound of the sentence, you know, the sound of the word, the sound of the sentence, the way that word changes that sentence, and then there you are, and it's a day. But so for me, lots of times I will, especially if I'm writing something from a different time period, I will set aside some time just to listen to the music of that period.
Mhm.
And you know, sometimes you get very, you know, I spend a lot of time looking for sort of like obscure recordings from, you know, whoever it might be, sort of Gladys Bentley at a cross-dressing nightclub in late 30s, you know, always one step ahead of the law. And so a lot of that tends to inform, I feel like I do have an internal Sirius for a lot of different stations, and one is for writing things set in the past, and the other one is just for me in my life.
NoViolet, what about you?
I'd say music, not just for the sound of it, but what music can actually offer in moments of unrest, restlessness. Reggae music was certainly on my mind because it's especially dancehall, which is quite popular with young people in Zimbabwe today. Is they're channeling it towards protest. I think 2 weeks ago, one of our biggest reggae musicians had his concert interrupted by the police, who came on stage just as he was about to sing a very famous song against corruption. So it speaks to the agency of that art form. So yeah, I was certainly sitting with music.
Well, music seems to be the one that comes up particularly. Elizabeth, what about you? Visual art or music, do they play into your process?
Yeah, I'm very, very, very drawn to the art of Edward Hopper. And I every time I look at one of his paintings again, I'm so intrigued with how much space he takes up that is not what the point of the not the point, but whatever he seems to be painting about is not. What I'm trying to say is, okay, if there's a light on in an office and there's a woman in the office, that's up there. But then there's maybe 2/3 of that canvas is different swirls of darkness that are getting their way up to that light. And I just find that to be really, really interesting about him. And I keep going back to his work a lot because I just find it very compatible with me somehow.
Thank you so much. We're talking about form and categories, and as you know, we've got writers here from the non-fiction category and the fiction character, but all of you have moved across boundaries. And I know, NoViolet, I mean, initially you conceived of Glory as a work of non-fiction, didn't you? It was going to be a work of reportage, but then that just wasn't something that felt that it fitted the story that you wanted to tell. That's quite a big moment when you realize you've actually got to switch to a completely different form.
It's different, but also not too different, because I feel like stories are stories, and some of these ways in which we differentiate them are not so, are not so meaningful. I think most on the panel would agree with me that fiction can very much speak the truth as nonfiction does. So what it gave me was the flexibility, for instance, to include and invent as many voices as I felt were necessary to tell the story of a nation. But in terms of what it allowed me to speak to the Zimbabwean story, the Zimbabwean experience, I feel like it still is truth.
Sheila, I wonder if I can ask you, because this is something that has come up a lot as people have discussed and reacted to your writing. I know that I've read that you've kind of resigned yourself to this word autofiction, although it's in many ways a kind of stupid word to describe what all fiction is to some extent. But it also seems to be something that attends women writers in particular. So when you wrote your novel, Motherhood, which was about thinking about whether or not to have children, it brings with it all the kind of baggage of people then asking you about your own life. And I wonder how much that plays a part in your shaping new work.
I don't know. I don't know exactly if this is what NoViolet was also saying, but for me, the choice of genre is really just what word can I choose that will give me the greatest freedom to make the book whatever I want it to be. So for me, also with Motherhood, I started off thinking it would be nonfiction. And then at some point I realized I would rather think of it as fiction because it gave me more opportunities to invent. You can just bring more in when it's fiction. Nothing else really changes for me except that you can bring more in. I think with a book like that, of course, people are going to ask me about my life. Maybe they do ask women about their lives more than they ask male writers about their lives. That's probably true. But I guess the way that I wrote that book, I wanted it to be a book in which a person reading it would think about their own thoughts on the subject. And so it didn't seem wrong to me for people to make it about me or themselves, or, it wasn't meant to be a story that you would look at as something kind of written apart. I wanted it to be like a portrait of a brain. And like an example of how one brain could work through these problems. So, yeah.
That's a very good phrase, a portrait of a brain. Thinking about, I was struck, sort of just intrigued by something that cropped up in both Elizabeth's novel and Amy in your memoir, the business of women's work and cookery and cleaning up and all that kind of thing. Amy, described even at moments of great sort of emotional duress and turbulence and upset, that you would still sometimes think to yourself, why am I'm picking up the kitchen like a kind of old-fashioned wife again? And they seem to be very, very humorous moments, but moments that you clearly thought were important to include.
Well, yeah, I mean, I have been a mother and a wife for just a shockingly long period of time because I started very early. And I think there were moments even when I was making breakfast for Brian and for a young friend of ours, and we have a counter in the kitchen, and I just thought, first of all, what's wrong with this picture? Why am I doing this? Why are they sitting there like happy customers? And also, it was very comforting because you do know the pond that you're born into. You do swim in that water. You swim in that culture, and sort of there I was. Also, I have to say my mother was a terrible cook and a violent opponent of all domestic skills. And so I learned a lot of these things sort of on my own, and they were great comforts. And also there were just moments when I was trying to summon up those kind of domestic gods, and I just couldn't. And those for me were actually quite sort of shattering. I feel like there were two things that I noticed the last 3 years that Brian was ill. One is that I was in 5 car accidents, almost all of which were my fault. and I couldn't make a decent meal.
Mm, yeah.
I burned, smoked, destroyed everything I tried to cook. And at some point I just thought that's that. Sandwiches for everybody.
Thank you. I wonder, just before we run out of time, I'm just going to try and squeeze a couple more questions from our audience in. You are anonymous, and you also call yourself, you worry that this is a silly question, and we're going to say there are no silly questions at all. But an anonymous attendee says, I am a novice writer. Is there possibly more scope for telling rather than showing in memoir writing compared to fiction writing? I actually think that's a very good and interesting question. And I don't know the answer, so I'm going to throw it to the writers. Margot, may I start with you?
Sure.
It's a thorny kind of question. It could go in it opens up lots of possibilities, doesn't it?
It does. Because what I often hear as I teach at Columbia in their MFA writing program, and what I often hear is students kind of coming up against, butting heads with, for example, the very traditional fiction show Don't Tell. I think, okay, that's healthy. You're looking, there's so many ways to tell, and they aren't all opposed to modes of showing. Memoir, which is very being kind of rambunctiously, we're claiming some space here, and in the hierarchies of literary forms. Memoir, you can't just tell. You have to find ways to dramatize, to be subversive, to be subtle, to do subtext, to do, and that self has to be pretty damn fluid as a character. Or maybe not fluid, but versatile, I would say, as a character. So it's, I think the novice writer is also grappling with, possibly books by writers and declarations and interviews where those pronouncements are made. It's finding your own way via the story and your voice.
Elizabeth, I mean, you're nodding there, and I mean, tell us what your response to that is.
I disagree with what Margaret's saying. Is I would say to anonymous, you have to find your own way. I mean, it's almost like the person's looking from the outside in, and you have to be inside out. You see what I'm saying? You've got to be in the material, and then you can figure out how to get the material out, but you can't start from the outside and go in, if that makes any sense. So, I mean, I don't know if that makes any sense to you, Margot, but that's what,
sure.
Doing what you were saying.
And disregard those imperatives, or,
yeah, exactly. Just do it. Just get inside it and see what happens. I mean, my 3 Lucy books are all faux memoir, which is interesting, and they're very different from my other work, and that's just but that's just what happened. That's what I needed to do to get this particular Lucy stories out. So I mean, I was just like, go and do whatever you find you can do, however you can do it inside it.
I would also say, just to think about the Lucy books, that despite this character who's their central spine, they are very different from one another. I don't know if that's how you feel about them. They tell 3 very different kinds of story.
Yeah.
Listen, we're nearly out of time, and but I can't leave James McPherson, who has asked a question. I can't not ask his question. He says, how does the literary and the quotidian seem to shape your experience of writing on the page as a driving and inspirational force, feeling the thrust of the work of your peers and predecessors, reading and floating above and apart? Gosh, that's a question with a lot in it, resonating within you, yet writing down something altogether singular, yours. I guess really it's a question about finding your own unique original voice, putting out of your mind all these predecessors. Who would like to start that? Sheila, I'm going to look at you.
I mean, it's that, but it's also for me feeling like there is a conversation happening with your contemporaries, which gives me a lot of pleasure. Writers who I know personally, whose books I read in manuscript, writers who I've never met, whose books are coming out. I mean, I like to feel that we're all in this world together, looking at it from different vantage points, putting our like strengths and weaknesses to, to the task of making something. I don't think that for me it's about feeling shut off and alone and having to pretend that I'm the only writer. I think I love reading my contemporaries and being part of a conversation through our books. Yeah.
Thank you. In order to not to single people out, I'm going to go what on my screen is clockwise. And Amy, you're next. What's your answer to that question?
When I started writing, I didn't know any writers. I didn't know any writers at all. My parents had both been journalists. Watching my dad was very educational for me because he approached it like he was a plumber or an electrician. You have a job, you do it, you get paid, you pay the rent, that's the gig. It was not a lot of, oh, look for your muse kind of behavior. And that was helpful. I think I didn't start writing till I was 35. I had a full-time job. I had 3 kids. I had a spouse. So when I started, I did not feel myself to be in conversation with any of the writers I admired, living or dead, because I was so aware of the fact that I was 100% not in conversation with them. And also for myself, I think I had to really write as if there was, there was the reader, as NoViolet says, there's the reader and there's the way I hope the sentence will land for them. But really, I felt that I had to sort of abandon my family mentally in order to write. I could not think about what those people were going to think, although I sort of certainly felt that I was sort of carrying them along with me. And so now, it is a real pleasure to feel that I get to read and talk to people whose work matters to me and interests me very much. But when I am writing, it's really just me and the story.
Thank you. NoViolet, what about you?
Yeah, I share pretty much some of the sentiments that have been said. You are part of an old tradition, part of a collective. I learned to write. I also didn't know any writers when I was growing up. I didn't even have a strong desire to be a writer. It wasn't something possible. But I learned to write from books, reading other writers. And when I came into my own as a writer, it felt like I was part of this ongoing collective, part of these conversations. And I hope after my time passes on this earth, my work will obviously stay on, continuing those conversations for those who will come after us.
I would say that's certainly the case. Margot, your memoir is about peers, predecessors, influences, isn't it? In one part. That's one strand.
No, I think all the way through in certain ways, because I depend so much on the words and thoughts of other writers. That always thrills me. Well, it sometimes enrages me. When you're a critic, you're in conversation, but it's a peculiar one because you're also a spectator and you're also to a certain extent in playing the judge. So I would say what's been most exciting to me has been to try for in criticism and in other, and in memoir, try to find other ways of connecting with my peers, with my predecessors, with people those who will come after, and with the facts of life and the world, the so-called quotidian that we're all encountering. That's all right now really descending on us.
Thank you. And Elizabeth, a final word to you.
Well, when I hear the word quotidian, I just love it. I mean, I just love that. That's practically my favorite word, if not my favorite word. So I'm off with that. I just think quotidian is where everything exists, from my point of view. But in terms of not knowing any writers, I didn't know any writers for years, but I was always aware of every single book I had read helped me. And then, but what I do want to end on is that I write for a reader. I am very, very engaged with the reader throughout the whole process. It's a made up reader, but I'm in a dance with the reader, and I'm trying to take them for a safe trip. So
It's a very good dance. It's a very good dance. Thank you so much. What a dance I've had with all of you. It's been amazing. 5 utterly brilliant writers, all so deservedly shortlisted in their various categories. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. You will find out how to buy their books in the chat. We wish you the very best of luck as the prize is announced next Monday. But it has been such an honor and a pleasure to speak to you all and to hear you speaking to one another. So it just remains to me to say thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to the Rathbones Folio Prize and to 5x15, and good night.
thank you.
Good
Right,
night.
thank you.
you.